Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Blatchford from Courage. Welcome, Father.
Thank you very much, Colleen. It's good to be here. Thanks
It's
for
great to
inviting
have
me.
you. It's great to have you on the show today. I'm really excited for this conversation. And why don't we just start? Can you just give a brief explanation to our listeners of what Courage's mission is and what your involvement there has been like?
Sure. Courage is a Catholic apostolate. It's a apostolate within the Catholic Church that was formed in 1980, late September 1980, at the behest of Terence Cardinal Cook in New York City. He saw a need for those who experience same sex attraction to have some sort of a pastoral care provided to them. And so he started to look around for priests who might be able to provide it. And he found Father John Harvey by way of recommendation of Father Groeschel. Father John Harvey was a oblate priest of St. Francis de Sales in Philadelphia, and he had taught extensively and done pastoral work extensively as well in the area of homosexuality and the church's teaching. He primarily worked with religious and priests who experienced that, but where it was unwanted, they wanted to be able to freely choose how they reacted to such inclinations. And so in 1980, he met with six or seven people. That was the first chapter. They met at the National Shrine of Elizabeth Seton in downtown Manhattan. And the members came up with the name Courage because they would have to have courage to live this way themselves, with themselves, sort of courage in the face of their temptations, but also courage in the face of the world. Because very often when people make this choice, they tend to lose a lot of friends or there's kind of things connected with it. And they came up with five goals to live by. First, to live chaste lives. Second, to develop a life of prayer and dedication through the life of the church. So reconciliation, Holy Communion, spiritual direction, etc. Third, to form a fellowship in which we can freely share what we're going through, so nobody has to go through the struggle alone. Fourth, to form chaste friendships because they're not only good, they're necessary for a chaste life. And really, that's where we can find joy in the midst of suffering in this life. And then finally, to live lives of good example to others. And it sort of grew over time. And now we're in uh, 23 countries. We have over 220 or 230, I think it's 230 chapters spread around the world. We're growing very fast in Central and South America as of right now.
Mm.
And it functions as a peer support group for those who experience same-sex attraction, who have decided that, I want to live in accord with what the church teaches. I think that the Lord is asking something of me, and I think that, I've not found happiness in this other way, and I think the church might have the answer. And so we provide that pastoral care in the form of a local meeting, a local chaplain, a priest who gets together with them, once a week or once a month, and we kind of check in and hold each other accountable. During that time, though, as it started to spread to New York and Boston and Philly and these larger cities, we noticed a need of um, loved ones who had members in the community, in members in the lifestyle who identified as LGBTQ, and they needed support as well. How do I live my faith and maintain these relationships without compromising it? Mostly parents, but it, we also have other groups. This is known as Encourage. In 1987, it kind of became a informal thing. In '92, it became officially a part of Courage International's pastoral work. And while it's primarily parents, I would say, who come and say, "Well, how do I maintain this relationship with my son or my daughter?" We have a group for spouses, so husbands or wives whose spouse may experience same sex attraction, but who's trying to live the teachings of the faith, and this is a support group for the spouse, but also siblings. This is uh, usually older siblings who are trying to figure out how to navigate this relationship with now their kids and their uncle or aunt. And we have five goals for them as well, and they're pretty similar to kind of develop that spiritual life, to understand more what the person is going through and what they're experiencing, so that we can respond in love and charity, to maintain healthy relationships, to assist others in reaching out in truth and charity and compassion to our loved ones, and to witness to others that fulfillment in life is to be found in Jesus Christ alone. And so that's kind of a little history of courage, I guess you could say.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because I knew that you did ministry, like pastoral ministry for people with same sex attraction, but I didn't really know much more about it besides what I was looking through with the materials you sent me before this. And then that is a nice jumping into the what we're going to talk about today, which is Catholic anthropology. And then we'll do a part two episode talking more specifically about what individuals can do in when they have encounter people struggling with same sex attraction in their lives. So keep an eye out for that second episode coming soon. But let's just start by what is Catholic anthropology and how does it relate to this whole discussion?
Sure, sure. So the word itself, anthropology, the study of anthropos, the study of man. It's Greek. It's you could say the philosophical science or of looking at man and his nature. And what do we mean by his nature? Well, those things that that make us who we are. What is in what way do we exist? What way do we be? Without getting too philosophical about it, just sort of those basic things about our being. And so when we look at man, we see that there's a story about this person who's both a body and a soul composite. And so when we talk about Catholic anthropology, we're talking about a few things. We're talking about God's proposal. We're talking about what our reason has told us because He made the world reasonable, and what the church has told us, and what we've seen via reason. I mean, Aristotle did some really great work and stuff like that, but really in what man means and by what we can understand about his nature then tells us about how he should act and how we should treat him and those kind of things. In fact, kind of a way to begin this in many ways is rather than speaking of the philosophical terms of anthropology, we can think about how we communicate to each other. Um, so if you'd asked me, oh, what went on yesterday? I wouldn't like give you like a verbatim timed. Well, I woke up at 6 and 5 seconds later I got up, right? Like that'd be a really boring story. But rather we kind of pick the highlights, those things that communicate our values, our beliefs, our perceptions, the things that are important to us, things that are meaningful, and then we weave this story together where maybe I had come to the studio to record this. Rather than do it remotely, and I said, I ran into this friend of mine from college. I hadn't seen them in years. It was really great to see them, and we talked about this and that. Like we bring all these emotions and values into it so that it's interesting. You see this in movies and books. Books that are very interesting and engaging and communicate these values well are timeless. And so we see that within this sort of communication of ourselves, we communicate our beliefs, how we feel about certain things, what's important, and when when we're doing so, we're also formulating how we see ourselves. See, because we have reason, the choices that we make affect who we are. As a body soul composite, the things that we do with our soul affects our body, and the things that we do with our body affects our soul. And we'll see that as we kind of get into the story of how God created us, that we're not just body or just soul, but rather a composite of both. Like the body's not just something that we're going to get rid of or I can do whatever I want with, but rather it informs our soul and our soul informs our body. And so the choices that we make actually make us into the person that we wish to be. I think it's Cyril of Alexandria. I'm probably getting it wrong. Maybe Cyril of Jerusalem says, we by our choices, we give birth to ourselves. And so, in communicating our story and in coming up with this story and communicating it and making all these value decisions and sharing it, we come to understand who we are. And as we do that throughout psychological development, especially during adolescence, we start to figure out, well, who am I in relation to other people? Who am I in relation to the world? Who am I in relation to other men or other women as a man or a woman? Who am I in relation to somebody in the context of love, in the context of romantic love, in the context of emotional intimacy or intellectual intimacy or psychological intimacy or physical intimacy? And so as we're kind of sorting those things out, the story begins to change. And what we'll see is that like when we start to talk about how we kind of identify, if we talk about labels, like it kind of cuts off some of really who the person is. When I can tell you about my story, when I'm telling you about who I am, and you say, "Oh, so you're a Democrat or you're a Republican," and then you just throw me in that box, like it completely dismisses everything else about me. And so the church does a great service when she says, "No, no, no. Labels are not sufficient. We need to look at the dignity of the human person." And so as we begin to look at what it means to communicate that story about ourselves to another person, right? We can start to see the story that God has revealed to us about creation. Pope Francis says before we can give the moral consequences, which is part of the anthropology, right? What we can and can't do, right? First, we have to understand that 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 God loved us into existence. He didn't have to create us. He loved us into existence. He wants us to be here. And when we recognize that, and that's how we begin to interact with each person, that he loved that person into existence, when we take their story seriously, what they're telling us, then we give them an opportunity to also take it very seriously. And they hear that they're loved. They recognize that we've invested in them, that we care about them, that we're going to suffer with them. Because as you communicate with somebody else a story about something happened, like maybe say, let's say you're at a near car accident, right? You're telling that story to somebody. Your brain patterns start to match up. Like that's empathy or sympathy rather. Like we start to the mirror neurons fire differently. Well, I'm getting too far out there, but we actually start to like uh, the bodies start to mirror each other because we're trying to understand what it is that they're communicating. But you see, as they're communicating that story, we have to remember the story is not just what I've experienced in my own life, but rather all it's what's been communicated broadly by God as well. Because we live as uh, body, soul creatures here in the world. We can sense things, we can see them, smell them, taste them, touch them. We interact with reality. And so it's important for us to understand what that story is. And that's really what anthropology is. When we talk about Christian anthropology, it's not a set of rules that are inflicted upon somebody, but rather the proposal of a beautiful story that God has to tell us. And even the pagans recognized it in that way. Aristotle's work on the physics and metaphysics and ontology, so man and his being and man's relationship with God, communicates that same beautiful story in a different way. He didn't have all the truths, but he already began that long before. We looked just at Revelation or the theology of the body. John Paul's using those same things. And so, what is the story that God happens to tell us about his greatest creation, right? The being that he willed, the only visible creature, right, that he willed into being for its own sake. Yes, he willed the angels for so, but they're not visible, right? Everything else that is a visible creation was created for us, which is pretty cool, you know. And so when we start to look at the story of creation, when we look at the beginning, we see, contrary to the pagan stories where two halves are made or one is made and it's split in half and they wander looking for each other, or it was an accident of the gods, we see that a god lovingly, knowingly, and with full possession brings both male and female into existence in his image and likeness. Let us create man in our own image and likeness. In our image and likeness, let us create him. Like we see this understanding of relationality, that we're supposed to be in relationship, that we have this ability to reason, uh, to the image and likeness of God, and that we're made male and female. That complementarity is a very important thing. I mean, it's not an accident that God created it this way. He intended it, and we can see that when we start to look at the nature of a thing. How it exists, how it acts, what it's for. Like for instance, if you look at a spoon, if you pick it up, you can recognize that this is not for cutting steak. Now you could, but that's not what it's for, right? And so we can see through the way that we're created how these things kind of fit, and we can see it. It's not just a biological thing. It's not just a sex thing, but rather it's a psychological thing. The structure of the human brain develops differently between men and women from the time of gestation. The amount of hormones actually structure the brain cellular structure differently so that we relate differently to things. Now, we can all have different personalities. That's true. But those things, that are complementary. They're set already just by the genetics.
Yeah. Did you hear about the recent study that showed that an AI was able to tell, like, did scans of a whole bunch of brains, and then it was able to determine with like 90% accuracy if the brain scan came from a woman or from a man based on just the brain
Yeah,
patterns?
I
Yeah,
can believe it. I mean, doctors can do that, so
yeah, it
it
was
would
just
make sense.
interesting. They're like scientific proof that men and women's brains are different, and I think most people's reaction was no duh. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think there's this belief that we can like separate two things from each other when it comes to our existence, right? Like I said, the body is just kind of like this meat machine, right, or chemical reaction, right, and how I feel about myself or what I think about myself is what's most important.
Mhm.
And what God intended, as we see it, in the story, in the creation story, is that no, we're supposed to experience all these things as a whole, with the whole of our being, body and soul.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is when you really start to get into some of the things with the different like neurochemical reactions or neurology, neurostructure of the brain is like, yeah, no duh, right? Like it really is complementary. From within days of being born, little girls are more attentive to faces than boys ever
Mhm.
are. In fact, more than boys will ever be, to be honest. um, and it's because the female brain is made to bond with people,
Mhm.
right? It's made to bring in to nurture relationships, and like that's a really important thing. I don't do that as well, you know. I'm one of 10, 8 boys and 2 girls, and I know what you're saying. Those poor boys, they had to put up with those girls. I understand it, but we love them. No, I'm just kidding. So the youngest is a girl, and she's lovely. But they're both spoiled. They're both spoiled, not rotten, just spoiled uh, by their brothers mostly, but also by our parents. But we see this interaction, like we see this great desire to that of bonding with other people that actually moves a man right out of his family, and then to sacrifice for something that like he wants intellectually but doesn't necessarily want to sacrifice for, to work, this job and sign over a paycheck, right? Like,
Mhm.
I mean, I know this is more of a traditional understanding, but just, it like it kind of helps us see that, like, she draws him into this, and then he's like, well, for you, I'd do anything. And then they have this, they build this beautiful family, um, and they bring about new life. And it's an incarnational reality of the Trinity when you think about it, right? Like the Father gives himself fully to the Son responds, giving himself fully to the Father, and the Spirit is poured out upon creation. And the same thing is true within the context of the family.
Mhm.
And so we become incarnational realities of God's love. That's another way of thinking, like in persona Christi, right? Like
Mhm.
Christ is the incarnation. We become a incarnation. Not big I, little I. Like we don't want Father doesn't want to be a heretic, but that's what it really means. And that's why it's so important to have this complementarity. It's not just because, well, we see this in the genetics. Like, well, yeah, but God Himself is a communion of persons, and so He created us to be a communion of persons, and that there's this complementarity in it. But we're also all made for this, for a union, a union that's not just two physical bodies together, but as close as possible, right? And that's part of the longing of the human heart, and why we end up in sin very often is because we have this longing for intimacy with others intellectually, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And we can't obtain it because of whatever reason, a bad relationship or a trauma or inability. And so we seek it out with a thing, an object, a particular type of relationship or acting. And it just it ends up sadly in suffering. And I mean, that's not just about, you know sexuality either. I mean, it's true for those with body image issues or overeating or workaholism or alcoholism. I mean, we can go on and on about that stuff. So
Any type of sin, really, it seems
yeah,
like. Yeah. This might be a little bit philosophical or theological, like rabbit trail. But I was a philosophy major, so that's why I'm asking. Do you think there's a difference between Catholic anthropology and Protestant anthropology? I guess I'm thinking of Calvin saying, "Oh, the body's bad, but the soul is good," or Luther with the whole dung covered with snow. Like, do you see a difference there, or do you think they're the same?
yeah, no. So there's definitely a difference,
Okay.
and that was part of a big argument that's gone on for 800 years within the Catholic Church on anthropology, sin and grace, between the Dominicans and the Jesuits, but also between the Protestants and the Catholics. The I always get it wrong. Um, Basically, the understanding of like absolute corruption. I know I'm using the wrong phrase, but like we can never do anything good, and it's just Christ covering over us, and the
Mhm.
Father seeing that Christ and not us, that makes it good. I mean, like that negates the possibility of transformation, right?
Mhm.
It means that no matter what, there's no reason to do anything better because
Mhm.
we're still covered. Now, there's been a lot of nuance that's developed since the 1500s. So I don't want to be unfair
Yeah.
of sort of different reform theologies and things like that. But we still kind of run into that problem where, the question is, well, is man still, is he able to be transformed by grace?
Mhm.
And that's really kind of what we're looking at. And when you start looking at anthropology, that's really one of the most important parts of it, right? Like, okay, well, God created us as male and female. He created us complementary, right? And He created us for this union. So, like, well, what does that mean? Well, I
Mhm.
mean, part of it means that we have to learn how to receive love as a son or a daughter, as a beloved son or daughter from God, but also that we're supposed to model that to other people and be spiritual fathers or mothers. And in fact, like
Mhm.
that's our primary vocation, right? The universal call to holiness. Like if I can't, and if we don't know that about our anthropology, that like the only thing that's really going to make me happy, the only thing that's really going to answer the longing of my soul is to learn to receive the love of God and then to turn around and offer that love to people who are suffering and in need.
Mhm.
Like I'm going to be so consumed with my own things and what I'm worried about, or compulsive behaviors. So a compulsive behavior would be like a habit that we develop over time, where the very opportunity of achieving something we can't stop. So like maybe it's I don't know, chocolate brownie or chocolate chip cookie or something like that, right? Like we've indulged it so much that when it's in front of us, we can't say no anymore.
Mhm.
So that would be addiction,
Mhm.
or vicious habits. Like if we're struggling with some kind of a habit like that, whether it be with sexual acting out or desires or things like that, if we can't learn to receive and love ourselves the way God does, and then to give that love to others,
Mhm.
we're going to continue to struggle with it, and we're going to get kind of tied up within our own minds, and like I mean, that's one kind of hell, to be so concerned about how others think about you or you think about others or what could other people be thinking or judging or all these things. To be so concerned with, and we've kind of been raised that way. There's a bunch of books on it. I won't go enumerating them, but like the idea that we've kind of been raised into this narcissistic culture where everybody's special and unique, and everybody should get a trophy even when they don't succeed. I mean, and that's not me just being old school, as it were. It like there's a real need to understand that I need to be able to grow, and I need to be able to rejoice
Mhm.
in others being better than me, right?
Yeah. It seems like a little bit of the whole virtue is a mean between extremes because on the one hand,
Mhm.
people aren't tools that you can use for your own benefit. Like having to recognize the fact that each individual has human dignity as an important individual, but also that you're not the center of the universe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and like, I mean, think about it, like, especially when we get in to all those things, like when we think we are the center of the universe, right? Then all of a sudden our labels become extremely important, right? Like how you see me or how you define me or how I define myself, really, right?
Mhm.
And it allows for me, like, oh, you don't accept this particular, thing that I've declared I am. Like, okay, I can write you off, and I'm never going to talk
Mhm.
to you again. I'm going to go find someone who approves that, right? Like that that makes me the center of the universe again, right?
Mhm.
And it means that there's no place of dialogue with people who we love who might not agree with us. And especially like as a priest, like I encounter people all the time who disagree with the church's teaching and with the way I interpret them, who are faithful, and even people who aren't, even people on the street who completely disagree with the ministry that I do. And yet, you know, we can have a kind conversation. We have a loving conversation that's just not, arguing about this, like this way or that way, but rather, trying to find a way to love each other and to enjoy each other's company. And maybe for some times that's not going to be necessarily talking about these things immediately, but rather kind of bonding over something else and then slowly getting into it. We can, especially like as Catholics, we need to be wise as serpents and cunning as serpents and innocent as doves. That's what it is. Sorry, I always get that mixed up. Um, but I had a friend of a friend who was a psychologist, had to do marriage counseling, and he was working for the state, and he didn't know how he was going to handle it because he had to take anybody who came through his door, and he's a Catholic. So divorced and remarried, same sex and opposite sex couples, thruples, everything. And he realized that, some of these people might not be able to receive what I have to give if I'm giving it from the context of the gospel. But what can they receive, right? This is Thomas's Aquinas's famous phrase: "What is received according to the mode of the receiver." I can read off the catechism paragraphs to a 5-year-old. It means nothing to them. It has to be given to them in a way that they can receive. And so if somebody is hostile to the Catholic Church because of a bad experience or they're just not familiar with it, well, we ought not quote church teaching at them. But what we might be able to do is speak about the importance of sacrificial love in the context of a good, healthy friendship, and that marriage is a unique form of friendship. And so we have to live with sacrificial love for the good of the other. And that good has to be a good that's transcendent of them. Okay, well, now we're talking about things that like we would talk about in the context of doing marriage prep in the parish, right? That's how we would talk about the Catholic marital relationship, and yet we've not mentioned the gospel, so we could it directly, and they might be able to receive that. And if we grow in grace in one area, well, what happens? We start growing in grace in other areas, and as we increase in grace, we have to decrease in sin because we can't be more virtuous and more sinful. That's just not
Mhm.
how it works. And so, anyway, I don't want to get too far down that, but like there's a good to like being comfortable talking about these in things in many different ways, and
Mhm.
especially as proposals instead of rules. Um, we'll talk more about it later in the next episode. But chastity is not doing something.
Yeah.
The Catechism says chastity is the virtue by which we integrate our sexuality within the person by means of self mastery over the whole of life. And if you wanted to make it a little more, I guess, psychological, or kind of unpack it, it's how we integrate our thoughts, feelings, and desires about sexual things or sexual pleasure within the person in a healthy and harmonious way so we can freely choose how to interact with them, or
What
so
does
that we
that
can
mean in
free. Go
practice?
ahead. Well, that means self possession,
Okay.
right? So, for instance, well, as a Catholic priest, beautiful woman comes up to me and kisses me, like I'm gonna react to that. I'm a human, like I have a body. My body reacts to that. But I can still be free to make the choice, to say, okay, thank you very much, right? But this is the life I've chosen, and this is how I'm going to proceed. Or even if it's just the feelings I have inside, as
Mhm.
opposed to feeling compelled to follow a particular path because I've habituated it. So
Mhm.
chastity is about not making us repress something, but rather being able to examine it with compassion and curiosity, and be able to respond freely with the whole of our bodies and souls in loving somebody. And that can be two men loving each other, even if they have same sex attraction, not in the context of a physical sexual relationship, but a good, healthy friendship, right?
Mhm.
Intellectual intimacy, emotional intimacy, psychological intimacy, social intimacy. They're good, healthy friends. They share ideas. They have good conversations. They share the inner workings of their minds and their hearts, and what that means for them. And even on some level, excluding the marital union, physical intimacy, a hug, a handshake, a proximity. We all need that. We all desire it. And in some ways, sexual pleasure can become sort of a run around that, right? Like, so the neurochemistry that goes on with orgasm and sexual pleasure binds two people together, as it should, because it right, because of what God has planned for it. Well, let's take a step back, right? So what does God have planned for it with the complementarity of the persons, right? When man and woman come together, there are two aspects to sexual pleasure primarily, and four total characteristics. There's the procreativity and the unity, so the union of the two spouses. The Lord uses sexual pleasure to join the two persons together, but also so that they may cooperate in the creation of new life. Now, that doesn't have to happen every time, but it is a part of what he envisions for it. Then, because of those two things, there's also a permanence, because if a child's going to be born, we have to be able to raise it, and so there's this idea of, okay, well, we're open to this, and then fidelity. And what we see is that sex is super powerful. This is why everybody thinks we get hung up on it. It's not because it's bad; it's because it's so amazingly awesome and powerful that it binds two people together for the whole of life when they follow what God has proposed. And what keeps it from becoming selfish is the fact that they're going to possibly bring new life in, and they're going to be on the hook for 18 to 20 years. Like, oh, okay, well, like, we have to we have to be able to be open to that. Okay, then, that there's some other things that we have to establish, in job and a house and marriage and all these things, right? And sometimes that doesn't happen. That's okay, but like, this is the ideal. This is what we're looking for. And so when we're looking at the purpose of sexual pleasure, it's to draw these two people together and to form a community, to form the smallest building block of society, and to imitate the Trinity. And
Mhm.
so when we're looking at that, and then we start talking about seeking sexual pleasure, we need to keep in mind those four characteristics. Because when the church says that it's intrinsically disordered, like homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered, that's a technical way of talking about sin, and so we would need to unpack that. So in the Catechism, what it's saying is um, the order that God has proposed for sexual pleasure is for the union of spouses and the procreation of children, open to the procreation of children. And it has a note of permanence and fidelity as well. So complementarity, procreation, union, permanence, and fidelity. If any of those are missing and we're seeking sexual pleasure with a member of the opposite sex, with ourselves through pornography, masturbation, or lust, all of those are intrinsically disordered. God has proposed this is how sexual pleasure can make you happy, and this is what I intend for it to be used for. If you can use it as you please, you have free will. But if you do, you're not following the order that's intended. And that's what the church means when she says intrinsically disordered. And so all of those things would be intrinsically disordered. But she's very careful to say this is not the person who is disordered. It is not the person who is intrinsically disordered. It is the action. And we are not our actions. Very often, I think in the modern world, we kind of hear this understanding that we are our actions, we are our feelings. And the church would say, while we are body soul composite and our actions and our thoughts and our feelings do affect us, and they have real effects both ways, both on the body and on the soul, they don't make us who we are. We can still freely interact them and walk away from them. Like I don't have to eat that brownie. I don't have to eat that chocolate chip cookie. And so when that, even if it's a strong emotion for that chocolate chip cookie or brownie, that doesn't mean that it's good, and it doesn't mean that I have to do it. And it's interesting that the world says that same exact thing about everything except when it comes to sex.
Yeah,
That
that's
it's
true.
it's at that point where it's like, oh well, I feel this strong feeling and it's about a sexual thing, therefore that's my happiness. You cannot deny it, and if you deny it, then you hate me and you don't love me. And I'm, that's and that's where those we kind of get back into those labels.
Mhm.
um and we can just use them to say, well, you don't accept this label, then I'm not going to be with you.
Would you say then that our actions form us, but they aren't us? Is that like a way of kind of
Yeah.
clarifying that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that'd be a good way to talk about it. Just
Because
like our
obviously,
feeling. Go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say, obviously, like performing virtuous actions is gonna like help make you a virtuous person. So the actions do have an effect on who you are, but just because you've acted in a certain way doesn't mean that you can't use your free will to stop acting that way and kind of reform who you are.
Yeah, exactly. So the way we learn things, uh, is actually by making mistakes, and then we have this little pleasure release when we figure it out, and that helps us to remember it. And as we do that more and more, we get less and less of a response from it. And
Mhm.
so, when we leave the house with clothes on, we don't get this little dopamine spritz in our brain. Yeah, you did a good job. Maybe when we were 3 or 4, right? But not now, right? Because we have to remember that we've been doing it for so long, we don't forget. Well, the same thing is true with what we call coping mechanisms, right? So when you're really stressed out, what do you do? Like for me, I start thinking about a bacon cheeseburger, right? Charbroil, melted cheese, the umami of the milk, and the proteins sort of having been changed, and the aminos and all that stuff together. Fried egg on top. It's so good. That, or maybe some sort of Vietnamese food with fish sauce, because it does the same kind of the umami flavors, right? Well,
Mhm.
we call it comfort food for a reason, right?
Mhm.
And that's because it comforts us. Now that's one way to do it, and it's not a bad thing. It's bad if we do it a lot, but that's one coping mechanism. We might spend time with friends. We might go get a coffee. We might have a meaningful conversation. We might go and pray. We might go for a run and work out, or we might sexually act out, right? Now, obviously, that one is unacceptable. It's sinful. Or we might use drugs, or we might get drunk. And these things are all. I mean, I'm making very large general statements, so you know, we have to keep in mind that I'm not trying to answer anything, because the Catechism says very clearly we don't know where these things come from. Like we don't know where the psychogenesis of homosexuality is. It's just unclear. And the same thing is true for gender questions and such. But as we develop these habits, um, if we if those coping mechanisms are insufficient to deal with a trauma or stress or emotional discomfort, then we start to turn to the ones that are, even if they're not healthy, or even if they're only answering a momentary emergency. You can think of them like firefighters. Like, I don't want to feel this. This hurts too much. Okay, then I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go to Burger King and get a couple Big Macs right now,
Mhm.
or I'm gonna go hook up with somebody, or I'm gonna get drunk. And so we can kind of see that like those coping mechanism, that's how they develop, those habits develop, and then we get to a certain point in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That's a tough thing to struggle with, and like, do we even see how all these things kind of fit together um, as we're building those habits? Sometimes it's subconscious, sometimes it's conscious, um, but it's hard to see how those things necessarily develop, and then we get to a point where we're like, how did I get this habit, and
Mhm.
how do I remove it? And imagine trying to remember, right, to not dress yourself in the morning, not lounging in bed, but like, for whatever reason, maybe you're in heaven, right? And you don't have to get dressed anymore. There you go. Like we would like our bodies, like we are. It is so deep within us, like we don't forget. In fact, it's one of the best ways to start a new habit is to slip it into your morning routine,
Mm.
because it interrupts such a deep habit that, like, as long as you can get it in there and do it for like a week or two, you probably won't forget it again. In most cases, sometimes you will, but like, and you can fix incredibly deep bad habits by doing that very easily. Uh, so anyway, we can see how, yes, making those choices and forming those habits in one way can be undone in the other way. But that also doesn't necessarily mean that, like, we're saying, oh, you have to change your orientation. Like, the church doesn't care about your orientation, to be honest, in that sense, right? Like those things don't have to change. Now, we do all stand in need of the transformation of grace, that type of change, right?
Mhm.
Like, we need to be saints. And that's really what courage does. Like, courage is concerned with helping people become saints. We
Mhm.
want you to be able to be free to choose what is before you, right? Or to respond to the thing that is before you in a virtuous way.
Can we go back to what you just said about
Sorry.
orientation? What exactly
Yeah.
do you mean by that?
Oh, that we don't have to change it. So, for
Yeah.
instance, you might have heard of you might have heard of the passing of a bunch of laws on bans on conversion therapy,
Yes.
and they talk about how people would be shocked or parts of their brains would be removed or what have you. Much of that is kind of fringe science. It wasn't the common thing, but now they've taken it to include even people talking about anything that's remotely contrary to anything but affirming somebody's inclination
Mhm.
or desire. And what courage would say, the church would say, really, is, look, if somebody wants help with anxiety or fear or racing thoughts, or maybe some questions they have about family of origin, or how
Mhm.
they relate with people, absolutely pursue that. We can find peace in that, and we can then respond in a healthy way to others best when we kind of have our own sort of room and order, if you will. But if someone came to me to say and said, where can I go to 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 get counseling so that I'm a heterosexual, and they let's say they're a person who experienced same sex attraction, I would say that you shouldn't do that. To seek counseling with such a narrow outcome is foolhardy, and it's kind of setting us up for failure, because one time in which I don't have that inclination, right? Like, one time where, like, if I'm seeking counseling to have heterosexual orientation, heterosexual desires, and even once I don't, like, okay, it's failed, right? And
Mhm.
so it's not a good way to measure it. Whereas, like, if you say, what I want is, I'd like to enter into a therapeutic relationship so that I can freely choose how I wish to react to whatever desire or thought comes up. Okay, well, that we can see as good, right?
Mhm.
And the
So
church would see it as good, rather than conditioning somebody to only act in one way. The church would say, no, people are supposed to be free, and that is a part of their dignity, to be able to freely choose.
so instead of trying to use something like that to change the emotional response that you have, like, say that you're someone who struggles with same-sex attraction, instead of trying to go to therapy to then be attracted to people of the opposite sex, that like the church wouldn't say you have to go do that, but you can use therapy to try to lessen the strength of those feelings maybe so that to help you live chastely. Is that kind of an
Well,
understanding
it's
or
I wouldn't even say it's necessarily oriented towards reducing the strength of those feelings. It would be more like I'm trying to think of a good example. So an individual who's experiencing some sort of a vicious habit, a habit that they've kind of let get out of control, whatever it might be,
Mhm,
it's connected to emotional distress, anxiety, fear. Psychology would say anxiety or fear of one time type or another, or perhaps anger. If we can find a way to address that anxiety or fear and reduce it,
mhm,
um, so that I can understand it, not in the sense of repressing or crushing or moving, but so that I can freely respond to it and I understand, like, oh, my worries about how this person or that person perceives me i- is is wrong. It was just made up in my head, or it's inaccurate, or it's just my perception, um, or it is accurate, but it's not as important as I thought it was. Right? Like that can reduce the emotional tension that's there, and reducing the emotional tension in somebody who's struggling to respond freely to anything, whether this is true for someone who has, like, let's say, an addiction, or somebody who has a compulsive behavior, um, to address any of that emotional tension so that they can respond more freely and choose another coping mechanism. That's always going to be good. And so it has little to do with changing an inclination or reducing the power of an inclination. It has more to do with just kind of sorting out a lot of the other stuff so that when those things are up, there's not another sore or stress kind of pushing and adding to it.
okay. I think I sort of understand. Is it basically like let me see if I can put this right. The church calls us to chastity, and so obviously you're not able
Yeah.
to act on those strong feelings. But then other than that, you kind of have the freedom as an individual to figure out what will best help you live chastely?
Yeah. And I know what you mean by act when you say chastity doesn't allow us to act on those things. It doesn't allow us to act, and I'm just going to clarify. Um,
Mhm,
uh, Chastity does not allow us to act in a way that is not uh, that's not in accord with nature, is not moral, right? But it does allow us to act insofar as I can respond to it, right? So, for instance, I may have a temptation to lust, right? And if I can hold that and think about it and think about, okay, so what's going on in my life that might have led to this, right? Like, I mean, obviously, I'm a 40-year-old man, and other men at 40 have a family and wife and kids. So that could be something just naturally from physical and psychological development that could come up. Spiritually, maybe I'm not spending as much time in prayer and getting to know God and relying on Him as I should. And since I don't have a family, biologically, of my own, that needs to be a larger part of my life, as well as working with my spiritual children, right? Um, and actually investing in them, not just doing things for them, but truly being invested in their well-being and loving them. So maybe that's a part of it. I'm also a man, and I need loving not only from men, but also from women, even though I'm celibate. So have I cultivated good, healthy friendships in a way where I can receive some of that feminine genius in my life that draws me, that encourages me, and helps me to be a better man, to live out my masculinity in a more virtuous way. And those are just a few things. I mean, I could be stressed out and I haven't exercised or done my prayer or spent time with friends or whatever it might be. And just looking at it in those terms, once I begin to sort of sit with the thought or the desire, I can then start with compassion to unpack it and see where it comes from. St. Francis de Sales, in his Introduction to the Devout Life, book 4, chapter 6, well, chapter 5 and 6. Really, the whole book's good, but book 4, well, the whole thing is good, but book 4 especially, it's on temptation. Chapters 5 and 6 are the short 4 or 5 pages of it. He says there's 3 stages: there's suggestion, delight, and consent. He said they can come for any reason. We because of original sin, we have no control over our thoughts. We have no control over our desires. Nobody does. And so that's one of the big things that courage kind of helps people understand and then live with, is like, oh, I'm not alone. There are other people who have, desires that they don't want. And yeah, and that's a part of life. And here's how we start to deal with it. And he says that when those suggestions or those thoughts, those desires come in, he said, don't even fight them. Just bring Jesus into them, because if you fight them, eventually you'll get exhausted, and then you'll give into them. He
Mm,
said, if we don't give delight, if we don't take delight in them, and we don't give consent, then we can't sin. So at that point, don't worry about it, and just if it's flying around in there, try and understand it with compassion, with curiosity, bring the Lord into it, try to understand what the Lord might be asking. And Viktor Frankl kind of makes the same point in Man's Search for Meaning. He says that those who suffered in the concentration camp and said, why do I have to suffer this, why does this happen to me, they ended up to despairing and dying. But he said those who said, what is this suffering asking of me in this life, what is God asking of me by this suffering, you know they found a transcendent reason. And so when we start to look at it in those terms, and we say, well, what could God be asking of me from this temptation, from this thought, from this desire? What could what what could be what could just be asked of me, because it could be the flesh, it could be the world, or it could be the devil, right? In that order. Um, and so what is it that God's asking me to respond? And maybe that could be that I'm not giving myself enough freely to other people when they ask. And in that selfishness now, when I get stressed out, this temptation comes up. Well, I'm not gonna figure that out without some serious unpacking, right? Um,
yeah,
so we got to go talk to God. We got to spend time in adoration and go to the sacraments and good, healthy friendships, etc. But yeah,
interesting. So basically, I guess to kind of sum it up, it sounds like Christian anthropology is basically we're body soul composites made out of love by God to be in relationship with Him and other people. And then within that, it relates to same sex attractions because it's helping people figure out a way to have a healthy relationship with people around them in a way that's in line with what God intended us for. Is that like a
yeah,
really
yeah. I
brief
would say,
summary?
well, I would say that he made us complementary, right? So he made us male and
Mhm.
female for a reason. Um, and original sin is a reality. God does not create people gay or in the wrong body. Rather, our souls and our souls not doesn't isn't male or female. Rather, the soul informs the body, and the body informs the soul. And yes, the person is male or female, but like we could get into that discussion another time. But like, and that can't be changed, right? And so God didn't make a mistake, but original sin allows for a lot of questions and a lot of worries and things like that, and that's okay. That's okay. Um, that suffering is a reality. And so I would say in summary, like, God intentionally created us to be the way that we are. He did not he doesn't, by his permissive will, meaning directly, intend for us to suffer ever. But it does happen because of choices that we make and others make in original sin. And within that suffering that occurs, he can always bring it about to something good. Sorry, we kind
Cool.
of got a little past some of the anthropology we covered, but maybe
No,
we've
that's
covered
okay. That
something.
was it was good to tie it back into this. And then when we do
Yeah.
our next episode, we'll talk about responding to this in the world because obviously this entire like it's become a big conversation that everyone kind of needs to know how to respond to in today's day and age. So
Yeah.
I think it's really important to keep having these conversations.
But I'd just say one other thing to kind of get back to the narrative or the story understanding. You know, uh, is the story being written by the things that occur to me? Right? Is my story being told externally, like from the things that happen to me, or is it being told like, am I writing it? Are the experiences that I've had writing my story, or am I writing it in the way that I respond? And then when we encounter suffering, when we encounter relationship, we encounter other people suffering, then we can make a choice that a truly beautiful story can be told. But if we're just pulled around by whatever experience that we're having at the moment, even if they're internal feelings and emotions and thoughts, it becomes a very chaotic and painful story to read, because the timeline's not clear. Hope, you can't have hope if you don't know where you're supposed to be going, and this is being pulled all over. So I think that's just kind of something to keep in mind as we, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about chastity, and then how do we encounter and help somebody, how do we listen to that story, right, and tell them that they're loved, and tell them that God has a plan for them, that they're a part of God's story, of this bigger story that God has written with creation, like that, like You are a necessary part of God's story of salvation for the world. That's an incredible sell that I think we miss. Anyway,
Well, thank you so much, Father. This has been a great conversation today. I've really enjoyed it,
likewise, likewise.
and I look forward to having you back on.
And I look forward to it as well, Colleen. Take care.
And to all of our listeners, please like and subscribe. Check out the new ebooks we have coming out and keep on living the culture of life. God